Good evening, everyone. Is the sound okay? We are filming this, you see, so we should do a check first. Thank you for attending the second of this year's IMMRC MITRA lecture series, Fabricating Futures. This time around, I'm supposed to take care of both the general introduction and the introduction of tonight's eminent speaker, Sarah Green. I'll start with the latter and bring in the general later on. So I'm going to be, as Laura Nader would say, introducing up. That's an inside joke. Sarah Green is Professor of Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Helsinki, and she is currently the co-editor in chief of Social Anthropology, Anthropologie Sociale, the quarterly journal of IASA. Sarah Green was born in the UK, grew up in Greece, in Lesvos and Athens. Back in the UK, she obtained a PhD degree in social anthropology at the University of Cambridge, and afterwards obtained a research fellowship there. The results of this research was published in a book entitled Urban Amazons, Lesbian Feminism and Beyond in the Gender, Sexuality and Identity Battles of London. Urban Amazons is a reflexive ethnography of feminist and lesbian gay activism in London in a politically heavily loaded context, such as the abolishment of the Greater London Council, you remember Ken Livingstone, and its Positive Images campaign on behalf of lesbians and gay men, to name only this. In this context, Sarah Green describes divisions within the lesbian feminist community in terms of experiences and ideologies, but also of spaces, in a study that thematizes issues of voice, silencing, and marginalities, issues which Sarah Green has been engaging with ever since. In 1995, Sarah Green was appointed Professor of Anthropology at the University of Manchester, during which time she published her magnum opus, I may call it like that, Notes from the Balkans, Locating Marginality and Ambiguity on the Greek-Albanian Border. One way of summarizing this complex story of Notes from the Balkans is that it traces a hegemonic story told by many people around there about these borderlands, that they had been undergoing a process of abandonment and neglect. This book was based on many years of ethnographic work as part of an interdisciplinary European Union funded research project. It was about transnational projects like this that in 2005 Sarah Green co-authored a timely paper in Current Anthropology describing how information and communication technologies had become part of political place-making, and highlighting in this paper that internet-based projects simultaneously and ambivalently endorse a moral community and a flexible network sense of connection. After 17 years at Manchester, Sarah Green joined the University of Helsinki in 2012, where she continued conducting research and publishing on the eastern peripheries of Europe, the Greek-Albanian border, as well as the Greek-Turkish border in the Aegean Sea, as well as on epistemological and methodological issues concerning borders and spatial relations. I think it is quite obvious from a whole number of publications, and I'm just going to mention a few which may particularly connect to this to today's lecture. Performing Border in the Aegean, A Sense of Border, published in the Blackwell Companion to Border Studies in 2012, and Borders and the Relocation of Europe, this paper, important paper published in the Annual Review of Anthropology. It is obvious from these titles how Sarah Green's expertise is to be situated in the area of space, while this lecture series is about time. The full title of the series is Fabricating Futures in Economies of Finiteness. It's about aspirations and immobilities, revivals and revolutions. It is concerned in most general terms with the multiple times and various temporalities that simultaneously operate in our worlds. Arguably, this is what a large part of Sarah Green's research has been about also. I think at least, I hope, that this will transpire from tonight's lecture. But let me very briefly give you some cues, some strong indications that much of Sarah Green's work has indeed been about time in many different but important ways. Urban Amazons was also about how London lesbians situated their struggles, their predicament and position in a rapidly changing and turbulent urbanity. Notes from the Balkans also traced a story of different moments of appearing and disappearing in different transformations. And I'm now quoting Sarah Green. It considers various ways in which such appearances and disappearances were constituted, not only in stories but also in maps and other techniques of accounting for places and change. In a conference paper of 2009, tonight's speaker reconsidered borders both as traces and as tide marks, mixing the notion of place with the sense of time passing in different ways, different moments. In a sense of border, Sarah Green looked at three such different moments that constitute the Greek-Albanian border in the 1970s, time of the Cold War, 1990s, in the early post-Cold War period, and in 2010, when two states were working together from both sides to control trade and migrations, and this is very much still going on. In performing Border in the Aegean, Sarah Green traces the long history and complex temporalities of the Greek-Turkish border through situated activities and changing constellations of governmentality. And finally, in reciting the future, border relocations and everyday speculations in two Greek border regions, 2012, published in How, Sarah Green brings parts of these histories from both sides of the Greek border together, while thematizing how borders are constituted by both nostalgia and utopian hope. So we are now all the way back to the future. Dear Sarah, I have been talking far too much. I merely wanted to confirm what everyone already knew, of course, that you are absolutely the right speaker in the right discursive space at exactly the right conjuncture of personal and institutional temporalities. The floor is yours.
Carol, thank you very much indeed for that. I can't possibly live up to it, but it was a very, very generous introduction. And hello to all of you. I'm very pleased to be here, delighted to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm a year late, I believe, but I'm very glad to be here. So, yes, I am going to talk about time. We'll try and talk about time and space, of course. The future is not something that the people of Mytilene, the capital of the island of Lesvos, which is there, had been used to thinking about very much until recent years. Before, the past was more their thing. That's Mytilene's front place of it. In the Aegean region, the past is completely full, stretching back centuries, thousands of years even, as far as the eye can see, as it were. And the eye can see that history in the region. Everywhere. The material traces of that thickly occupied past are scattered all over the landscape. And tremendous efforts have been made to ensure that some of the more monumental examples of these traces are seen by tourists, by schoolchildren, by dignitaries who pass through to do something important, but who always take a moment to visit some museum or place marking some part of the past in the Aegean. The narrative of that past is different from the narrative areas further south in the Greek Mediterranean, around Athens and Attica and Crete, for example. There, the classical past of Greece was the most dominant story told about those places. In the Aegean, though, the biggest story that's told concerns trade. The Aegean region is where the oldest coins ever discovered were minted. There they are. And a testament, I was told by people there, to the length of time that people have been using the Aegean Sea as a trading route. And these coins were supposed to have been minted in the Lydia region, which is there. So Troy is up there, and this is the island of Lesvos. That sea, the Aegean, links quite distinctive eastern and western as well as northern and southern peoples and lands, and is relatively easily travelled, given that it has a scatter of islands across it and that can act as stopping points. People in Mytilene all emphasised that the Aegean, until very recently, was really an enormous crossroads for trade. Connecting the whole of the Mediterranean, if you will. So the Aegean is there. There's the Sea of Marmara with Istanbul located there. And you can see that location is sort of important. When I first began doing ethnographic research in the Aegean in 2006 and 2007, this is what people on both the Greek and Turkish sides taught me that this sea was designed for: trade. That is a key aspect of the place that everybody knew. On the Turkish side, there were several places, most prominently Izmir on the western Anatolian coast, which is down there, and Istanbul reached through the Sea of Marmara. They're just pointed out there. That were key parts, both of those towns were key parts of the Silk Route that reached all the way to China. And even today, Izmir has a prominent silk industry. Relating back to that original book that you talked about, there's a novel by a guy called Geoffrey Eugenides called Middlesex, which starts in Izmir. It's about a trans person, but it begins in Izmir with the silk industry. This is a passing point. I learned also that the western Anatolian coast, with its dense olive cultivation, provided large blocks of green olive soap for the entire Ottoman Empire for many centuries. There's a couple of the ones that are still produced today. It kept people of the empire clean, at the same time that people in Northern Europe were using tallow, that evil-smelling stuff made from animal fat, instead of these sweet-smelling vegetable oil soaps produced in Anatolia. So this is what I learned, that in the past, the Aegean had been a place of longue durée, in Brodel's terms, a place where life goes on for centuries, more or less in the same way, just changing incrementally, imperceptibly slowly. Even if there were occasional major events here and there, disasters even, overall, life just went on. So there was no point in thinking about the future. It would just be the same, or different versions of the same. Yet, in 2006, when I was being taught this fact about the Aegean, I was also being taught that trade across this sea had actually been prevented for decades. People in Mytilene were telling me these stories about the natural character of this sea because they were worried that the sea would be reverting back to this ancient trading reality. More specifically, they were worried about the possibility that Turkey might join the European Union. The reason that this concerned them had nothing to do with Turkey being a Muslim country, nor the fact that Prime Minister Recep Erdogan was already showing signs of being a neo-Ottoman demagogue, nor even the fact that the population of Turkey is so high that if the borders were opened, the islands might once again be full of Turkish people, something that did worry Athenians, according to the media reports. The people in Mytilene were not worried about any of that, at least not overtly. Instead, it was the prospect of trade that worried them. This surprised me, but I suppose it shouldn't have done. Mytilene, as everyone who reads the newspapers knows by now, is exceedingly close to the Turkish coast. But for reasons that I will go into a bit more later, contact between the Greek islands and the Turkish coast had been very restricted between the 1920s and the late 1990s. The trade had more or less completely stopped for over 70 years. But in the mid-1990s, an agreement called the Barcelona Process, and this is some labels advertising all of this event and some of its potential effects, was brokered by the EU between all the countries that had a coast on the Mediterranean, including Greece and Turkey. This agreement later became Euromed. Amongst many other things, the agreement made trade and travel between Greece and Turkey much easier than it had been before. There were still considerable restrictions, but for the first time in decades, the Aegean was being used for trade again. Since that change, an increasing amount of goods from Turkey were arriving on the islands, building materials, particularly stone and tiles, fresh fish, aniseed, used for making that quintessentially Greek drink ouzo, soft furnishings, leather goods, all manner of things. It was already causing local shops and producers some considerable levels of concern. Here's one of the local markets in Ayvalık, just across the way from Mytilene in Turkey. So the prospect of Turkey being given full membership of the EU was deeply worrying to many people in Mytilene for economic reasons, not for religious, political, cultural or social reasons, but because of trade. He expressed the view that the Turks were well organized, ran efficient businesses, had the advantage of scale in terms of range of products and price, and had a very long history of running things in the Aegean region. More than once I heard people say, if Turkey joins the EU, we are burned here on the islands, kaikame in Greek, meaning it would spell economic catastrophe for the Greek Aegean islands, for the competition from Turkey would far outstrip anything the islanders could come up with in response. In sum, after a short period of 70 years, during which it was interrupted, the Aegean would be returned to its longue durée destiny as a crossroads for trade, and the Turks would be in charge of that activity. This was the fear in 2006 and 2007 when I began research there. The 70 years during which trade was interrupted would, in the grand scheme of things, hardly register as a blip in the Aegean story of trade. Things would go back to the way they had always been. The fear of the future here was what had been bent out of shape about the Aegean since the 1920s. The prevention of trade across its shores was now being restored to what people believed was the Aegean's more natural state. It was as if it was inevitable, and that was bad news for the people in Mytilene as far as they were concerned. There was more. Already in 2006, people were talking about the increasing numbers of undocumented travelers crossing over from the Turkish side in boats and dinghies. At that time, locals in Mytilene thought that the migrants were Kurds, Iraqis and Afghanis. That's what they said. Already in 2006, there was talk of the makeshift camp. This picture was taken in 2006, not now. That had been set up to house these travelers so as to process them and decide what to do with them next. Already in 2006, there was also talk of a severe economic downturn in Greece as a whole, either on the way or already occurring. An Albanian stonemason I met in the spring of 2006 said that he was looking to return home as there was plenty of work, but no money. People paid peanuts, he said, if they paid at all. A taxi driver also told me that there was no money. He laughed when I asked why there were so many bank branches in the town of Mytilene. Every other shop seemed to be a bank branch of a different bank, even local banks. And he laughed and he said, everyone was borrowing money in order to live. That's why there were so many bank branches. Cars, houses, children's education, fancy clothes, nice nights out. All, he said, was on borrowed money. And borrowed time, he added darkly. There are no rich people here, he said, just people in debt. Most people I spoke to believed that the euro, the currency that had replaced the drachma 4 years earlier with some considerable hope and fanfare, because the drachma had been chronically unstable currency, had turned people actually into debtors. The euro, people believed, was a currency of debt. At least the drachma, however unstable, had lasted millennia, and you could understand its value, where it came from, who produced it, and save a bit, and then buy gold sovereigns with what you'd saved for safekeeping. It seemed impossible to people to save any euros. The currency slid out of everybody's fingers like water. These are a couple of signs. Well, the first one doesn't need translating. But again, they're from 2006, these are not from now. So there's a couple of phrases that were coming out at the time. One says, μάθε να σκέφτεσαι με λεπτά και όχι με ευρώ, δηλαδή μη σκέφτεσαι με χρυσές λίρες, αλλά με τάλιρα. What that says is, learn to think for yourself with sense and without euros. Sense as in pennies, without euros. In other words, don't think of gold sovereigns, but with pennies. And the second one says, θυμίζουμε πως το 1970 μια χρυσή λίρα είχε. It says, basically, we remember how in 1970, one gold sovereign was worth 366 drachma. And the euro now is worth 400 drachma. So they were trying to say that the euro had sort of inflated out of all value. And this one is a sign that was stuck up saying, consumer, think with sense and not with euros. So there was already a discourse about this stuff going on at the time. People were very pessimistic about the survival of the euro, even in 2006. And certainly nobody believed the euro would exist for as long as the drachma had existed. I've written about this issue elsewhere, so I won't go into the details here. My main point is that by 2006, fully 10 years ago, people were already talking about the two things that people cannot stop talking about now: financial trouble related to the euro and undocumented people arriving from Turkey. And I don't know whether you have this in Belgium, but in Greece there are antique shops that love old coins that no longer have any currency or any value, and people love to collect these things and go to antique shops and buy them. And there were already signs coming up of money transfers for the migrants who were coming through in various languages, for transferring money. All of this was a long time ago. But a sense of proportion is everything. Just as 70 years ago, just as 70 years of no trade can seem like the blink of an eye if you look at the Aegean in terms of millennia of trade, in 2006, people were not to know that the scale of these two things, the financial trouble and what became a refugee crisis, would change so much that everything would be bent out of shape again by the summer of 2015, which is when I last visited Mytilene. And here I have to go a brief moment about that. They like that word, Greek cartoonists. For those who didn't follow it, last summer was the Greek summer of no. On the 7th of July 2015, in the midst of bank closures and a major refugee issue in the Aegean Islands, the Greek voters said no to the Eurogroup's demands upon them. And this is also an interesting, I picked this one out particularly because it's no in Greek, but also no in Turkish. And that map shows the regions of Greece that voted no, all of them. And this map shows the degree to which they voted no. They all voted no, but it's between 50 or 55% or between 70 and 75%. So it was fairly clear what the Greek people felt about this situation. That vote was turned into a yes by Syriza, some said. An act of betrayal to all the voters who elected that party into government on its promise that it would resist any more austerity. Others said it was Prime Minister Tsipras's only option to turn the no into a yes. You can't negotiate if the other side refuses to budge with anything. Tsipras had to choose whether to stay in the euro or not. In any case, the euro had proven itself by 2015 to be definitely the currency of debt. But Tsipras could not see his way to walking away from it, even if his fiery finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, thought otherwise. And here's some scenes from this summer waiting outside closed banks for people to get their 60 euros, which actually, and people eventually getting terribly upset about it. Actually, it was often, in fact, 50 euros because the bank machines only had 50 euro notes in them, and because the limit was 60 euros per day, you couldn't get two 50s. So it was actually down to 150. These things mattered to people at the time. Also in the summer of 2015, Izmir, which was just across the way from Lesbos, had become the centre of very high-volume sea-crossing refugee trafficking. This is people selling these large numbers of these things and people waiting around to buy trips across to Lesbos. By July 2015, when I arrived, there were 1,000 to 2,000 people arriving every day on Lesbos. I was not to know then that it would go up to around 3,000 per day by late August, and has only returned to around 1,000 per day in the coldest part of the year. And that's people on the other side, waiting. In one sense, Izmir's reputation was a strange one, given the city's self-styled image as a cosmopolitan, secular, modern place, a place holding out against the conservative views of Erdogan. Yet in another sense, Izmir is doing what it's always been expected of it in this region. It's become a hub for trade. The trade attracting the most attention was this daily and nightly activity of sea crossings for those with plenty of money but lacking the right paperwork. During the summer, we did not hear much about the Turkish side of things in the EU press. Just that Turkey is now being paid a lot of money by the EU to act as a new buffer zone for the EU, to add to North Africa, which has been a buffer zone for decades, separating sub-Saharan Africa from Europe. Libya had a particular important role in that, but has been failing in this task in recent years, given that the country has fallen apart since the 2011 Arab Spring events. In any case, things felt overwhelming in Mytilene last summer. There was no money. Literally, the banks were closed. There were huge numbers of people with urgent needs arriving day after day. The new government was lurching from one crisis to the next. People had forgotten their fears that Turkey would destroy Mytilene's economy by becoming an EU member state. The Greeks and the EU had destroyed their economy without Turkey's help, it seemed. Suddenly, just as the Aegean was reverting to what people thought of as its natural shape, the trade. As a trade things was pulling it all out of shape again. A kind of monstrous refraction of what trading crossroads might mean. Nobody in Mytilene could see a way out. Let me leave Mytilene for a while in that mess, I'll get back to it, and move to Athens. I will start with Athens of 50 years ago, 1966. In that year, Athens was a vibrant city, a cosmopolitan city, a city full of tensions, rumblings of revolution, or at least a sense that people were beginning to have enough of the right-wing rulers who had been helped into government by a consortium of international powers in the decade before. By the USA, mostly, people believed. The US government was following the Truman Doctrine, trying to ensure strong conservative government to prevent the communists getting in. But it was not only the Americans, of course. Others had an interest in Greece, whether that was based on Cold War ideologies, romantic ideals born of reading classical history, or realpolitik. It was an edgy space in 1966, one that had been built in its modern guise on a tangle of partly contradictory and thoroughly cosmopolitan aims and ambitions. Bastea has charted how the core architecture of Athens, built during the 19th century, reflects a mixture of transnational and nationalist ideals of what Greece and the Greeks should be. It would be interesting to ask today, in the 21st century in the midst of crisis, whether those ideals, those dreams of an Athens built upon dreams of a classical Athens, built upon dreams of a modern Athens, were ever realized in any meaningful sense. Yalouri, who closely studied the variety of uses to which the Acropolis has been put, both symbolically and otherwise, also noted the strongly transnational influence on Athens from the moment of Greek independence right up to the present day. Athens is a transnational city par excellence, which is to say that transnational political and economic interests have had exceptional levels of involvement in the way the city and the Greek state, which has located the headquarters of its government there, has developed over the decades. That international involvement, or interference, some might say, continues today, of course, even though the way in which the involvement has manifested itself is rather different now. Many have suggested the difference is generated by a neoliberal form of capitalism, one that has turned everything into a consumer choice. Well, perhaps not quite everything. The exception is choice itself, not having any choice over the right to consumer choice seems a strange kind of compulsory freedom in a time of crisis, or at any time when people have no money, come to that. So this is an image of what Athens is attracting in the newspapers today. That's jumping ahead in this story about the entanglement between Athens, Mytilene, and its transnational connections and separations, and how that got entangled with bending the future out of shape. And it's in which I want to pay a particular attention to how these connections, transnational connections and separations, relate to the new people coming into these cities just now, in the midst of what most have labelled the twin crises of fiscal meltdown and refugees. Unlike Mytilene, where the media reports of the summer activities with refugees sort of depicts the islanders as people with brave efforts to help these people. Indeed, I don't know whether you know, but the islanders, the island of Lesvos has been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. For Athens, the world media have regularly reported scenes of conflict and the flaring up of apparent utter chaos between new arrivals to the city and the police. Not to mention the conflicts between the new arrivals and the self-styled anti-migrant vigilantes who have joined Golden Dawn. This is a few images of what Golden Dawn have been up to in Athens. It's easy to believe that many of these vigilantes joined the organisation, at least partly, in order to have the moral right to beat the new foreigners to a pulp. That would be analogous and incorporating analogous, ambivalent and intricate social motivations to the phenomenon of some young British men becoming football fans in the 1980s, partly in order to beat their team's opponents' fans to a pulp. In any case, the combination of these images of conflict and chaos coming out of Athens, anti-austerity uprisings and demonstrations on the one hand, and battles with new arrivals from troubled places on the other, has done a considerable amount towards generating the sense that a major crisis is underway in Athens. I'll return to this point later. Suffice it to note here that Reutemann suggests, Janet Reutemann, that crisis is a concept that has to be taken for granted in order for people to be in it, that is, in crisis, and also so that people can analyse what caused it, that is, the crisis. This means, Reutemann suggests, that the concept itself, crisis, becomes an unanalyzed blind spot. It forms the backdrop within which everything occurs without actually thinking through the assumptions that are embedded in the concept itself, assumptions that might actually contribute to creating what it is describing, the crisis. Reutemann doesn't deny the seriousness of the experiences that people described as being in crisis find themselves. In her case, she was studying the financial crisis in the USA. Rather, she is simply asking the question, what difference does it make to call these experiences and events a crisis? Reutemann's focus is on those who have the power to create the labels and what effects those labels have. In thinking about Athens in crisis, my focus is rather different. It's on the people who are living with this label and who accept it as a reasonable account of what they're experiencing. What does it mean to them? And the reason that this is important is the way that the concept both links Athens with and disconnects it from other places and other times. I'll come back to that. In any case, the streets of Athens didn't look anything like crisis in 1966. I'm getting back to 1966 now, bouncing again through these time periods. And certainly not in terms of newcomers to the city, people like that. 50 years ago, Athens was home to a small but diverse population of those kinds of foreigners who do not think of themselves as migrants, but some other category of non-Greeks living in Greece, either permanently, temporary, or for only part of the year. Not that anyone could really have thought of themselves as an immigrant to Greece in those days. It was not until the 1990s that the Greek state developed any workable immigration policies at all, or migration legislation concerning foreigners. Consequently, the legal status of immigrant didn't really exist at all in Greek law in the 1960s. People in Athens were either Greek or they were foreign. There was no added legal, social, or moral nuance to that distinction, that sharpness conveyed by the term migrant, or even worse, illegal migrant. That is important to remember. In contemporary territorial politics, migration is a legally defined status, first and foremost. Migration may become a social issue and one that politicians argue about, but neither can happen before migration actually exists as a legal status. It's also worth mentioning here that not liking foreigners is not the same as not liking migrants. The implication of the word migrant, at least in Greece at the moment, involves a claim to some kind of belonging to the place, the land of Greece, in a way that is not implied by the word foreigner, xenos. While a migrant is clearly different from someone born in the place, they are nevertheless intending to stay. And there is an implied break with the place from which they came. In contrast, and within this kind of conception, a foreigner can only ever be a visitor. And however many years she or he stays, his or her belonging is to somewhere else. Migrants, on the other hand, are foreigners who either have a legal right to belong here, having moved from somewhere else, or who have every intention of staying here, even if they don't have that legal right, and that changes things in important ways. As both Gourgouris and Herzfeld have noted, in the case of Greek nationalist rhetoric, the moral connection between the nation and the exclusive right to a geographical physical location, a place called Greece, is intense. Within this kind of nationalist logic, it's possible to see no contradiction at all in being friendly towards foreigners and even priding yourself on hospitality towards foreigners, it's called philoxenia in Greek, while also being hostile towards migrants. The difference is a perceived difference in relationship with and claims to the land. In any case, in the 1960s, many of the non-Greek Athenian residents, the foreigners, were people who somehow felt a little uncomfortable in their own country, whether for social, political, economic, or legal reasons. Anti-apartheid white South Africans, gay men, tax exiles, a variety of writers, poets, artists, and out-of-work actors who wanted to live cheaply. The lack of any coherent government policy about what to do about foreigners made it relatively easy to live there. Of course, it wasn't an easy city, but it was easy enough to exist there as a foreigner without too many questions being asked. Athenians were used to these kinds of foreigners, transients who came and went, and who lived their lives largely separately from the Greek people of the city, though usually on friendly terms. A nod of the head, a polite hello in the coffee shop. There was not a great deal of interest on either side. The foreigners were also a matter of indifference to the Greek state, in all senses of the word, as they didn't formally exist in bureaucratic terms. It also meant that they didn't have any legal rights. So if they did get in trouble with the police, that could be very bad. But it meant they were something in a legal grey zone, or a black hole even. So as long as they didn't get in the way of anybody powerful, life just kind of went on. And it's difficult to imagine in these days of hyper-professionalization and securitization of migration that such a 1960s world in which the laws were so unclear about such matters actually existed. This all changed quite radically in Greece after 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was followed by the downfall of the two other socialist governments in Europe, former Yugoslavia and Albania, both of which shared borders with Greece. At that point, the Greek government developed a series of new migration laws and policies, much of which was written hastily and hardly discussed in Parliament at all. Politicians and journalists often suggested during that period that for the first time in the country's history, Greece was having to deal with immigration rather than emigration. The majority of arrivals in the 1990s were from Albania, some of them arriving, but there were many others from former Yugoslavia and other former Soviet areas as well. It's important to remember that the political changes in the neighboring states was not all that was going on, though, in terms of the geopolitics of migration during the 1990s. At exactly the same time, and not coincidentally, Greece was preparing to become a member of the EU's Schengen zone, which required Greece to be subject to Schengen regulations concerning border controls, and this is how Schengen. A lot of people forget that Schengen doesn't only open borders, it involves a host of new regulations for the countries that are part of Schengen, especially those that share borders with regions outside of the EU. So the first major law about immigration to contemporary Greece, the Aliens, Immigrants and Refugees Law, was introduced in order to comply with Schengen requirements. The way in which successive Greek governments have chosen to interpret these requirements, as many commentators at the time have noted, was to, and they were encouraged to do this by the EU legislation, was to regard migration as a security threat rather than some kind of other form of movement of people. And the law has been written in that style. So Samatas, for instance, who has been writing quite a bit about this, said that securitization prevails over human rights and civil liberties in Schengen land, end of quote. In any case, it's clear that control over Greece's borders in terms of migration coincided with the EU's concern of the Schengen zone, and this is, of course, very much still the case today. What went almost unnoticed in the 1990s arrivals of migrants from former socialist states was that suddenly everybody in Greece was talking about immigrants, where before they had spoken about foreigners. After the end of the Cold War and with the introduction of Schengen, these informal arrangements of the 1960s were unthinkable. The new laws and policies, combined with the building of an enormous border control infrastructure, basically created a particular figure of the migrant, both as a migrant and as being always suspect, both in terms of security and legality. So I'm going to talk through this through pictures. So this is how Schengen is advertised, but in fact there's quite a lot else behind it in the case of Greece. Now I'm going to talk through this previous period very quickly because I'm realizing I'm running short of time before I get to the main point. This isn't the first time that large numbers of people have been coming across the Aegean. In the 1920s, at the following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and various skirmishes, particularly between Greece and Turkey, the League of Nations, which is the precursor to the United Nations, arranged a compulsory exchange of populations between Greece and Turkey. It was millions of people. Those people who were Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, and of Turkish nationality were moved to Greece, and those people who were Muslim and of Greek nationality were moved to Turkey, whether or not they had any relations with those two places and whether or not they'd ever been there. There was millions of people that were moved. So it was the first time that large numbers of refugees were moved between these two countries. And this is some of the movements in the 1920s arriving in Piraeus from the area that I was talking about. And these are some of the people in actual Piraeus. And this was brokered, and these boats, except for the style of the boats, could be, the kind of boat scenes we've got today. Overfilled boats with people who are rather desperate trying to cross the very same sea that they're crossing now. And the interesting thing about the last skirmish in 1922, which actually occurred in Izmir, and this was Izmir on fire when the Greeks had moved into Izmir, claiming that as their land. The Turks had counterattacked and had set the city on fire, so the place was burning, and people, the only way out was the sea, and they were piling onto these boats. And the interesting thing about this scene is that it's not just a battle between Greece and Turkey. That there is an American flag. And the people who were known as the Great Powers, which was France, Italy, Britain, United States, all had boats on there watching what was happening. And they were ordered not to intervene. Didn't matter. People were burning, drowning. Didn't matter. The main point is that international connections were always there. They were always getting involved in what was going on in that place, even during that moment, and even the compulsory exchange of population was organized by international affairs. So you can't really understand what is happening in that place during the 1920s or the contemporary moment just by looking at those two countries. You have to look at the connections with other places. That's the main point I was trying to make there. Okay, so moving back then to that very same sea and the migration that was going on in the 2000s, the arrivals during the 2000s, these kinds of scenes seen constantly, that have also been described in terms of large quantities, was something else again. By the year 2000, the full range of regulations for compliance with Schengen had been put into place in Greece. That was combined with this strong securitization approach of successive Greek governments towards migration, lack of a political will to provide adequate facilities or resources to the newly arrived asylum seekers and refugees. It's not simply the fact that what happened last summer had not caught Greece by surprise. That had been going on for 10 years. There was a lack of political will. And Frontex, there was a lot of money spent on Frontex, which is the EU's border security organization, and they borrow ships from various other countries. In this case, this was from Romania. This one was from Romania. It's sitting in the harbour of Mytilene on Lesvos there. That was actually 2008. And the EU spent an enormous amount of money on border securitization and on Frontex and these kinds of things to try and prevent these people from getting out. In comparison to what they spent, the UNHCR has reported this very critically, in comparison to what they spent to trying to handle the refugees, it bears no relation. So that there was an absolute lack of political will, no political stomach to deal with the refugee situation. But there was a stomach for greater securitization. So then all those series of things that happened in the Arab world, from starting with 9/11, and then in 2003 with the invasion of Iraq, and then after 2011 with all the Arab Spring events, huge numbers of people had reasons to want to flee. But still nothing was done to cope with it, and then it finally exploded this summer. But what led to the sense of a kind of complete disproportion this summer with all of this, it had a background. It could have been predicted. So an apparently crucial difference between the 1920 mass movement of populations and this chaos this last summer was that it was apparently planned very carefully. It was an organized, internationally organized thing in the 1920s, whereas this was people just acting by themselves. But you could argue that, in fact, there was just as much organization this time, just on the other side, rather than actually moving the people, trying to stop them from moving and having no way of dealing with them. Now, as the summer of 2015 drew on in Greece, the numbers of new people coming in, already thought for several years to be way too high for the Greek authorities to cope, became, according to news reports, overwhelming. From the perspective of UNHCR and a number of other agencies attempting to deal with the situation, this was avoidable. Had there been a transnational will to set up the legal means for people to safely flee to places in which their lives and livelihoods, away from places in which their lives and livelihoods were in danger or already destroyed, and to relocate safely elsewhere, then the highly disorganized, dangerous and expensive trips made illegally, both across the Mediterranean and overland, would not have occurred. That's the UNHCR's view. In the views of many who had been commenting on the political and economic conditions of the contemporary moment, this is just one symptom of policies that are designed to allow the free flow of trade, capital, people and resources in line with neoliberal ideals, but which have strongly restricted anything that runs counter to that. In an ongoing battle just about everywhere in the world, Chris Gregory and David Graeber amongst the more famous people in anthropology to argue that. So, from this perspective, this particular political and economic geopolitical logic has created multiple regions in the world where life has become so harsh, either because of ongoing violent conflicts or because of extreme lack of resources or opportunities, that people are driven out to look for something else, some way to survive. Many of them head for Europe. And what they're confronted with is a highly intricate border control regime that was designed to keep them out. Now, as a result of particularly harsh controls in certain entry points into the EU, the vast majority of these people, as we know, have been coming through Greece. And with the economic situation that's been going on in Greece, it seems to a lot of people that that's, the fiscal crisis and the financial crisis followed by the fiscal crisis and then the refugee crisis was just one crisis piled onto another one, crisis within a crisis. And here, I'm going to come back to Janet Reutemann. I'm beginning to wrap up a bit. Her short book on the concept of crisis, and it's worth exploring in a little more detail, as it helps to understand how the concept of crisis has kind of, in my argument for this paper, bent the future out of shape in Greece. Reutemann argues that the work the concept of crisis does is threefold. First, the idea of crisis places events in historical time. Crisis breaks up everyday life by asserting that what is happening now is something different, something that is not normal, and something that creates a rupture. Second, crisis provides a means to morally judge events, to argue that something is revealed by this moment of crisis that was not so visible before. For example, the raw brutality of neoliberal capitalism. In that way, crisis becomes a platform for mobilizing political action in response to the crisis. However, Reutemann suggests, if you have to rely on the self-evidence of crisis in order to combat it, then you can only have anti-crisis, something to be against, rather than crisis and something else, something positive that could replace crisis. Third, and in contrast, crisis also provides a means to render things actually anti-political. Crisis is an unnatural or abnormal state of affairs contrasted to what is normal, and so it's conceptually conservative, seeking a return rather than something different. In order to get back to normal life, the natural order of things, you have to stop trying to make political points and instead do something to restore normal order. Somewhat ironically, the concept about the natural order of the Aegean as being about trade seems to echo what Reutemann says about the effects of thinking about things being in crisis. Things are bent out of shape now and will return to a moment when the future is irrelevant because life just goes on as normal. What this call for a non-foundational understanding of political action that Reutemann is making makes sense. There is something about the concept of crisis in the cases of Athens and Mytilene that Reutemann's account somewhat sidesteps, I think. And that is the question of proportion or scale. The implication of Reutemann's argument is that crisis is one of those conditions that is understood to occur at a scale beyond the local, both in its causes and in its effects. Crisis not only hurts the man or woman on the street, it sends out waves of effects to other parts of the world, and it is also created by waves of effects from other parts of the world. It's also considerably bigger than the things that happen to people individually. It is a crisis because it affects many hundreds of thousands of people all at once, and sometimes millions of people. The kind of crisis Reutemann is discussing, which is in fact aimed at understanding the concept of the term financial crisis in the USA, is not simply a personal crisis, one that any individual may experience in their lives as a result of a particular personal events or relations. It's a crisis that generates a domino effect, a crisis of global proportions. Now, while that captures something of the situation in Athens and Mytilene, there is another element of scale that's not quite captured by Reutemann's analysis, and it is the sense of the overwhelming character of what was occurring, the sense of disproportion involved. I'll go back to these pictures here. This was, in people's views, extreme, overwhelming, both because the events appear to be relentless and have no clear end in sight, and because there is such an enormous gap between these events and anybody's capacity to deal with them. It goes off the scale. It's hard to capture in words that peculiar sense of enormity that a people expressed to me, both in Athens and in Mytilene during last summer. It was a period during which arrivals of refugees on the island was at its most intense. At the same time, the Greek bank a bank run because of uncertainty of the outcome of the referendum held on July 5th, which asked the Greek voters to decide whether the Greek government should accept a new austerity package from the Eurogroup in return for more funds to help stave off default on repayment of existing loan. The whole series of events felt too large, and it was almost, I have to say, it was almost biblical on the island, because the refugee camps, each of them had a single bank account. And each bank account could only take out 60 euros a day. And so you had to feed thousands of people on 60 euros. You just couldn't do it. Corsan Jimenez captures something of that sense of disproportion in his discussion of the stress, anger, and helplessness of Spanish academics who were being asked to become knowledge managers in the knowledge economy, while being given none of the resources needed to achieve that, and at the same time being constantly audited on their failure to achieve it. In Athens and Mytilene, the sense of overwhelming enormity of the gap between what is possible and what is required demanded even, both in the case of the refugees and in the case of the Greek economic situation, was what made people feel that crisis was the appropriate description of what was occurring. It had also become the new normal, of course. The fiscal crisis had been going on since 2009. The financial crisis became somewhat earlier, as I said at the beginning of this paper. And the refugee migration crisis had been going on since the 1990s. Marianne Fermé, in her ethnographic analysis of Sierra Leone, describes how common it is these days for the abnormal to be the new normal, or normally abnormal, as she would put it. This is not so much an evocation of Agamben's state of exception as it is a sense that things ought not to be this way, but they are like that anyway, and are likely to stay that way for the foreseeable future. Crisis as a rupture, yes, but one that in this sense generates a new normal rather than a return. The future has really been bent out of shape, and now nobody knows what is going to happen next. To gain a sense of this development of disproportion, this sense of disproportion, it's worth going back just a few years to 2008, and this is where I'm going to finish, and I'm going to stop reading out of this and just talk. So this was 2008, it's a picture I took on Syntagma Square, Constitution Square in central Athens, and what this depicts is some people from sub-Saharan Africa who had arrived without proper documents, and they were selling stuff happily to people who were wandering around. So Constitution Square is right in front of the Greek Parliament. Right? So they were doing this right in front of the Greek Parliament. And then this guy is a police officer in a nice blue cotton shirt and short sleeves and cool sunglasses, sees them, and within a matter of seconds, and it was a cat and mouse game, they put the stuff together and they run off. The policeman passes by. Several minutes later, the guys come back and they start selling the stuff again. And this cat and mouse game, everybody knew their place and everybody knew what was going on, and it was going on. That was 2008. After 2010, when the financial crisis began and the refugee issue started to become more, this is what it began to look like. There were no nice blue cotton shirts of the police officers. They were now wearing flak jackets, bulletproof vests. They started wearing crash helmets, protective shields. They're kicking people in the street. The images are completely different. And the sense of disproportion, the change of how people were dealing with it in Athens was massive. And, you know, again, with the help of these guys. So what I'm concluding is that there's an order of magnitude different from the earlier period to such a degree that it's become a different kind of phenomenon. The cat and mouse game of 2008 allowed mutual recognition that everyone involved was human, everybody involved had a job to do. The police had to keep order on the streets, the traders had to try and fit themselves in between the policemen's rounds. The dynamic in more recent years seems to be based on no recognition at all. The perceived sheer scale of the problem has made it impossible, it seems, to see any of the people involved in it as people. They are migrants or they are police, and neither category appears to recognize the other one as anything other than a category. A far cry from the situation of the 1960s, in which the concept of migrant did not really exist at all. Now, there are people on the streets of Athens who are nothing but that category. So just conclusions, bending the future out of shape, back to the Aegean. There are three really main points about the relationship between the future and the current crisis that I have wanted to make here. First, it's not the first time all of this has happened. Economic crises, refugee crises have happened before in these two cities. However, it is the first time that people legally defined as refugees and migrants have arrived in large numbers. And that definition has depended in large part upon EU legislation and the formation of the Schengen zone. And it is also the first time that the fiscal and financial crisis involves a currency, the euro, that is not under the control of the sovereign state of the territory being worst hit by the policies involving the euro. What this points towards is that particular forms of relations and separations with other parts of the world, which includes the legal, political, and economic relations between different places, are as important to understand what's going on as studying the events in Mytilene and Athens themselves. Without understanding the fundamentally transnational character of this place, it would be difficult to make sense of what's happening. Second, the migration and refugee crisis is strongly tied to legal and technical changes made in relation to border management of the European Union region, has introduced a particularly strong moral rhetoric in Greece that was not there before. That process, which has a variety of political and economic motivations and logic behind it, has been having the effect of quite radically rearranging the relation between people and place. And that can be seen particularly acutely in both Mytilene and Athens just at the moment. As Bridget Anderson has noted in her study of migration policies in the UK, this not only involves a deeply ideological debate about the moral status of migrants, it also involves a deeply ideological debate about the moral status of citizens more generally. In the UK, Anderson argues, the definition of a morally upstanding citizen closely matched the economic needs of the UK economy, so that anyone who was not appropriate, whatever their foreign status, was morally corrupt and therefore a member of the undeserving poor. Anderson effectively questions the significance of the national border here, suggesting that the division between a migrant and a citizen who is defined as undeserving is almost no difference at all. The policies of the UK government suggest that in both cases the aim was the same, to disinvest. What is intriguing about that kind of rhetoric in terms of what is currently going on in Greece is that both European politicians and the media often write about the entirety of Greece and the entirety of the Greek population as being members of a morally unacceptable group. People who do not pay their debts, who do not work hard enough, who do not work by the rules. During the debates about the restructuring of Greek debt by the Eurogroup in the summer of 2015, the questions of whether the new government under Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras could be trusted was constantly raised as a blockage in coming to agreement. Here, the always already transnational connections and disconnections between Athens and other places, and most particularly in moral terms, became acutely visible. Third, and it's my final point, the overwhelming disproportion of what has been occurring in Athens and Mytilene in recent years is an important element to its experience by people as a crisis. It is not so much the idea of abnormality, though that is present, it's the enormity of the gap between the events as they're unfolding in people's lives and the capacity to deal with them. And that gap is not simply a matter of imagining either global forces or the sudden occurrence of unnatural disasters, as Reutemann describes. It's also a perceived unbridgeable gap between what people in these two cities understand is going on and how it is possible to deal with it. and what those who have a transnational stake in deciding what will happen next in Mytilene and Athens imagine is possible. The recent agreements between the EU and Turkey, in which Turkey will become the new buffer zone for the EU, will have a massive effect on Mytilene. But the people of that city have not been a party to the discussions at all. The situation is disproportionate, as Corsin Jimenez notes, or, as I would say, the future is all bent out of shape. Thank you. Sorry, I went on for a little longer than I wanted to. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah Green, for a wonderful talk. Very inspiring as well. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions, as there are always. I'm trying to fix a microphone here. Just give me a minute. Yes? So who's first? Patrick.
I wanted to come back a little bit to the notion of time. And we're saying at a certain time that the future has become important, even though in the past it was irrelevant. And so I wanted to ask, if you link it to what anthropologists used to be interested in, was mostly the here and now, and to explain that would be to refer also to the past. Now we would say that anthropologists are also interested in the future. So I wanted to ask a little bit in terms of, if people would rather not think about the future because daily life can go on as it is. Does it have to do with emotions? Does it have to do with fear? And is that also something that actually may have an impact on what anthropologists are getting interested in?
Very nice question, thank you. Two answers to that, I think. Can people hear me anyway? Two answers to that, I think. One is that one of the reasons of thinking about the future, why I set up the paper in that way, is people used to think that they knew what would happen next. And there was no point in thinking about the future because they just knew what was going to happen next. And if you feel you do know, then there is no reason to think about it. That also means, which was a doffing my cap to the theme of this series, if the reason to think about a future is if the future is not predictable. If you don't know what's going to happen next, then it's open. If it's open, there's a chance to be political. There's a chance to change something. There's a chance to do something. So the only reason to have any idea about the future is if it's unpredictable in a scary way, or if it's unpredictable in a way that opens out potential and possibilities, that makes it possible to think of doing something different from what's already happening. And I noted in the blurb for this session that one of the things that futurity might be about is thinking, what are the openings, what are the possibilities that people have for doing things? And what I tried to do with some of this material, which is quite dark nevertheless, because a lot of it was about fear, is to try and think through, under these circumstances, what could be political? Under these circumstances, if people find themselves stuck with this concept of crisis that Reutemann says depoliticizes, how actually could they politicize it? And part of it is to recognize that what makes them feel it's a crisis is this debilitating gap between what they feel they can do and the enormity of the problem. And so, but once that's recognized, then maybe there is something to do. And in fact, I think the May issue of Social Anthropology has got a special section on the concept of solidarity as it's been developing in Greece. by some very good ethnographers. So look out for that issue, where indeed they are exploring in the small everyday ways what could people do, and how are they changing the concept of solidarity, retrieving it from older political associations and doing other things with it. I don't know whether that answers. Oh, and in terms of anthropology, yeah, I could go on about that for a long time, but maybe I'll... Yeah.
I can try to speak up. Is it okay? My question is about boundaries. So that was something coming up a lot through your talk. And the thing is that boundaries can be seen on many different levels. So for example, very recently we're looking at Turkey as the new boundary of Europe. I've actually heard a Turkish ambassador for the EU referring to Turkey as the new boundary for Europe. We also have heard about recent developments where, for example, Austria wanted Greece to be outside of the Schengen in order to protect the European Union from these very large numbers of refugees. I believe that was because they saw Greece as unable to address this challenge. But I'm wondering, to what extent do you see the policies affecting what's happening on the ground? Do you think the perceptions of boundaries on the ground are affected by policymakers? Or is there maybe two different realities happening at the same time? So we have two different levels of understanding of boundaries. You were talking about the moral state, for example, and I recently heard George Katsoudoulos, who's the Minister for Social Justice, and he was interviewed for our talk, and his way of discussing the issue was very emotional in a sense. He was criticized by his interviewer for this. It was not very realistic, or what he was suggesting was not very realistic, because what he was focusing on was the moral aspects of the refugee crisis and how that have to take the forefront instead of the very practical issues, because the reality is that there are a lot of migrants, refugees arriving, and blocking borders doesn't seem to be a solution.
Thank you very much. Very good questions and very difficult to answer, quite a number of them. But one of the things about the question of policies and whether there are two different realities, of course there are. There are probably more than two. It depends what you're asking about, because on the one hand, the policies, if they're connected with laws that are exercised, and often with borders, there's varying levels of strictness and laxity over the control over borders. They will affect people's lives. What happens in their heads might be a different thing. One of the things that I've been interested in for quite a long time is the difference between a social definition of a border and a political one. And quite often the two don't overlap. Because Greek-Albanian border is a very good example of that, where often half of people's communities are on the Albanian side and half are on the Greek side. So even though the border is supposed to mark a national difference, in fact, in social terms it doesn't. So those things point to the importance of doing ethnography to work out those differences. But I think also one of the things about the politics around Turkey and it being announced as the new frontier of Europe, I should think Turkey is doing that partly because it deliberately wants to avoid being labelled a buffer. And the reason that they would want to avoid being labelled a buffer is because buffers are supposed to be empty, right? A buffer is a gap between one kind of place and another kind of place that keeps them separate. And if Turkey takes on that definition, then it disempowers it politically. So I think that's using that definition, and plus, I think they are finally accepting the politics of waiting for Godot. They know in Turkey that they're never going to be made a member of the EU. Their status is as being permanently an applicant, a candidate. And so I think they're playing that as much as they can. But in terms of the underlying implication of your question is the moral side of it. And I think that's an enormously important issue that hasn't been dealt with properly as yet. Because on the one hand, people are sort of saying, well, in practical terms, Greece can't cope with this. That might be because the requests for what was needed in order to cope with it haven't been answered. But the question there is what kind of boundaries are being made, in a sense. There are boundaries that are legal ones, that are the formal ones, and there are the others that are the moral ones, or the ideological ones, that are much, much harder to deal with. So I'm not quite sure I answered your question, but I hope that helped in some way. Yeah. There's some unknown.
Thank you for the lecture. You were mentioning something about the issue of belonging briefly regarding the rhetorics of the Greek nation and the kind of attachment to the place. So my question is about the contours of this belonging in the context of these multiple crises, where on the one hand we have Euroscepticism due to the Euro crisis and debt, and it's kind of located in the margins of the European Union. On the other hand, we have this increasing presence of non-European migrants. So how do you see these dynamics? Does this kind of facilitate this presence of non-European migrants? Does it facilitate the notions of Greek Europeanness? What is kind of making and remaking and breaking of boundaries in this sense? Where do you see these dynamics of, on the one hand, kind of distancing from the Europe and kind of approaching it in a relational sense?
Yeah, I think that's I wish I had Michael Hertzfeld here. I think he would answer the question much better than I can. I see this as a kind of a looping. So there's a reiteration going on. Again, I'm drawing on Hertzfeld's work here, his dicemia idea. It seems helpful, and I don't know who it's helpful for, but it seems that it keeps happening that in Greece, on the one hand, is fundamentally European, fundamentally modern, fundamentally even having created half the ideas upon which Western civilization is based. So there's lots of that. And on the other hand, it's the opposite. On the other hand is absolutely at the periphery, and absolutely what Europe could never be or shouldn't be, or maybe Greece shouldn't have ever even been allowed in the EU in the first place, because it always was guaranteed to misbehave. That kind of weird, paradoxical, self-contradictory thing has been repeated again and again and again in stories about Greece. And I think it's happening again now. So I'm not quite sure. It is different, but I'm not quite sure in what way yet. It's half an answer.
Would it actually help to bring transnational to explain how it's different? Because if you compare Athens, 1960s, it's very cosmopolitan, and then it's in the context of another type of transnationalism than the one that's going on now.
Yeah, it's part of the world as it was then, as it is now, and therefore it will be reflected in that. But I guess I'm also interested in how the discourse, the political discourse as well as the social discourse, is shifting and refracting the relationship. Greece can never get away from its past, and one of the tensions of that past is that a lot of it has been written not by Greeks, but by German, British, and French classical historians. And so it's had to refract its own classical past through other people's interpretations of it, which is fed back to it. And so that complication creates another tension. Never mind the tension of the Herzfeld emphasizes more about the difference between Orthodox Christianity and the classical story, which are very much in tension. So,
but you also say that the problem is fundamentally transnational, and yet you say, okay, the transnational is overseeing it, and yet they are not intervening in it, but it's really fundamentally influencing what's going on.
yes, I think that it would. Yes, it's a key point, but how you deal with that entanglement requires more ethnography than I've had time to do lately because I've been in Finland. Yeah. But it's a very interesting point.
Yes, perhaps in the same direction. I was wondering, perhaps, you mentioned it just once, the emigration thing. And I was then realizing that the Greeks featuring in your story are rather static and just waiting for things to happen and receiving foreigners and then migrants and so on and so forth. So I was wondering about two groups of exemplary, I would say, mobile Greeks. The very rich elites who were also very prominently sort of problematized in the current crisis, certainly the bank and financial crisis. And the Greeks who indeed left Greece and have been leaving Greece and have been important in colonial endeavors and then labor migration in Europe and so on and so forth. I mean, it's a bit unfair to ask a question about something you didn't mention, but I was just wondering how they come into, let's say, your equation.
Yes, no, it's in a way, it's a very good point. It's slightly ironic that you should mention that because one of the things I really emphasized in Notes from the Balkans was what a colleague of mine from Manchester calls the moviousness of the people that I was studying. They were always, they began from an assumption of being mobile, and therefore the idea that moving around is some form of displacement made no sense to them. It was a big point I made in the books. And I think probably what I was doing here, which is what made them look static, is I was taking moments as if they were like a snapshot and cutting out all the moving around. And of course, what people have been doing is leaving in very great numbers. They haven't been left with very little choice but to leave in very great numbers in whatever way they can. I was going to and fro between Greece and other places the whole period when, in the lead up to the intensity of this financial situation in Greece. And it sort of spread like a wave from the major cities, particularly it hit Thessaloniki and Athens first, and that led to a wave of emigration again, and then spread. It didn't actually visibly reach Lesvos until about 3 years after it had really hit Athens hard, and because people had a lot of little part-time jobs. They had an olive grove, and they ran a corner shop, and they had a taxi, and did a whole load of different jobs and managed to just kind of use Peter to pay Paul for a long time. And I think, and people were relying on remittances a bit more than they were admitting, and there was all kinds of different ways of dealing with it. But you're right. And I am really they really didn't make a... I often looked for, when the migration from other people came in large numbers, especially in this Aegean region, for people to say, well, my family were moved in the 1920s, so I understand where they're coming from. Or I have members of my family in Australia, so I know what it... They hardly ever made the parallel, which I was... If I mentioned it, people say, oh, yeah, you're right. But they didn't spontaneously do so. It was like two different phenomena.
Well, part of the disproportion.
Yeah.
Proves your point.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I like particularly the bit where you go into the history and you sketch how certain things are definitely not new, but how it's part of an ongoing talk. But certain things are new, and one of the things that I found very interesting was your discussion about categories, and how in the past there were less categories and it was maybe easier, and how now there are more categories. And as you also point out, many of these categories are not just categorizations, they also have legal implications. And I wonder how easy those categories are accepted, because of course if Greece is part of the EU, then at the legal and at the political level they have to comply, but at the other levels, I mean the people who are not involved in politics, how easily do these new categories travel, and also of course how are they translated, because these categories are not Greek categories, so they need to be translated in terms of literally language translations, but also in terms of cultural understandings of what these categories mean, not necessarily in a legal way, but in a way that people use them.
What categories like refugee?
Refugee, migrants, and all these categories that we know as what used to be the foreigners.
Yeah, well, the category refugee carries tremendous poignancy in Greek, prosophigas, because of the 1920s business, and most people have grandparents or members of their family who tell that story. And so when that word is used, and sometimes a variety of other words have been used, but when that word is used, it does carry a lot of nuances. But then people are having a lot of debates about it and how they travel. I haven't done enough work yet to say, but it's a very important question. Not only how they travel, but how they get transformed through that travel. I mean, I rarely draw on Latour, but here his idea of the mutable mobile as opposed to the immutable mobile, and understanding which of those two might be going on in these conceptual shifts is probably quite important. And it might be important actually more widely in trying to understand currently what's going on in the politics of the EU in general in trying to handle this question. I've recently went through the very painful process of applying for a Horizon 2020 grant, and in order to do that, I tried to find definitions for key European concepts. It's impossible. Categories like social cohesion, that's really important. A third of the EU budget is spent on cohesion, but there is no definition anywhere, I promise you, of what cohesion means. And obviously the reason for that is because if they tied themselves down to a definition, you'd never hear the end of it in the Parliament. Nobody would ever agree. And so I think this is a hugely important point, but I suppose the looseness of the concepts has to be part of it.
There's no more questions, then perhaps the last thing I want to say is that, yes, I've been thinking and rethinking title. And I thought, yes, the bending and the future were the things that captured me first. And I thought, you know, that's. But now increasingly, I think that shape is actually what it's all about. Shape, both in terms of sharpening forms. I mean, either in terms of categorizations, in processes of securitization, or indeed shapes in terms of, let's say, neoliberal economic terms, the hardening of these, the commodification, etc., etc. On the one hand, so that's in terms of creating problems, so to speak. And on the other hand, in terms of solutions, as you just said, I mean, when we're talking about how this future should look like in terms of cohesion, the conviviality, we're completely at a loss, you know, lack of definitions, extreme vagueness, and so on and so forth. So that's part of the impossibility to actually sort of act, so to speak. So I thought that was that's what's been keeping me.
It's a very good point. As you know, with me, it's always about shapes. I do anthropology geometrically.
So I would like to ask an applause for the lecture, but also perhaps informing you that our speaker was just 5 minutes before she entered the room was given notice that a huge ERC grant, advanced grant, what was the term again? Was granted to you. Well, anyhow.
Yeah. Thank
you.
you.
So that is very good news, and other people would have been out of their mind and drinking. But,
that's to come.
And, ask. So thank you very much.